Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 42. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers of the China Desk can watch on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com, and you can always access our podcast and follow-up information at thefederalnewswire.com as well. My guest today is Dan Blumenthal. Dan is Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on East Asian security issues and Sino-American relations. Before joining AEI, he served as Senior Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the U.S. Department of Defense. He served as a commissioner on the congressionally mandated U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission from 2006 to 2012, where he was vice chairman for 2007. He's author of China Nightmare, The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State, and co-authored An Awkward Embrace, the United States and China in the 21st Century. Dan, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thanks very much, Steve. Happy to be here.
Yeah, well, as I warned or talked in the pre-show, we like in every episode to give our audience a flavor for how someone ended up doing something so fun as writing books about U.S.-China relations and dealing with national security strategy. So were you the guy in third grade when the teacher said, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Say, "I want to be a fellow at AEI"?
Certainly not. Though I grew up in the D.C. area, I had no idea what that would entail. I'm the child of scientists, so very far from my mental construct and so on. But I did get interested in foreign policy, history, and political science in college, and knew that somehow I wanted to launch a career in foreign policy and national security policy.
What drew you in the direction of things China? As you've experienced in life, you might get some fun food, some risky food, but there's also a bit of a language hurdle for folks from time to time. What got you sucked in that direction?
Well, I started off as studying Arabic and doing Middle East policy, and
another easy
exactly,
area.
and was getting so tired of talking about the same various processes and dynamics and so on. And I always had in the back of my head an interest in Asia. And before I went back to graduate school and law school, I spent about 3 or 4 months traveling through Southeast Asia. And by the time I came back, I was convinced that that I was going to focus on Asia and looking forward to my graduate school education at Johns Hopkins SAIS and even in law school. So I got bit by the bug in 1996.
Mm-hmm. So Southeast Asia, which countries in Southeast Asia kind of whetted the appetite?
So I spent time in Vietnam. I spent time in Thailand, and then in Indonesia, where actually my father was born in Jakarta as a Dutch citizen, and so we had quite a bit of family history in Indonesia, which I spent some time there as well. When I came back and I was beginning law school, I was asking people, okay, I'm interested in Asia. I've got a language requirement when I go on to my graduate program. What languages should I take? And they said, take Japanese or Chinese. At the time, I think I was probably the only law student who kept applying for Chinese language fellowships, so I kept getting them. And it was just a very odd thing to do at the time. Most law students went on and worked in law firms over the summer. So received a fellowship to study at Middlebury Language School immersion program, received a fellowship to study in China, and got invested, had some sunk costs by the time,
Yeah.
I had
well, Middlebury is a pretty famous language program for people in and out of government, but there are a lot of people in government that would get sent up through Middlebury for language supplemental training or otherwise. So you head through Southeast Asia, academic pursuits pull you towards study of Chinese language, things China, etc. When's the first time you set foot in PRC, Greater China, whatever?
1999, I spent about 4 months in language study in Beijing, and it was quite a time because the United States had mistakenly bombed the as you well know, the embassy and Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Of course, the Chinese didn't buy that it was a mistake, so there were mass protests out on the streets in Beijing. I was living with Chinese students who were very much part of these protests and became very kind of ultra nationalistic and hostile to Americans. It was also the time that the Falun Gong breathing sect had showed up in Tiananmen Square, setting off, permutations and reverberations of paranoia throughout Beijing. And then Taiwan president at the time, Lee Teng-hui, made his comments that Taiwan and China should have relations based on special state-to-state relations, which was the third strike in terms of what China was blaming the United States for during that period. And so very difficult time to be there. I left convinced that we had a big problem on our hands back in '99. Most of my classmates and colleagues kind of left convinced that they could make a lot of money in China. So I just left thinking we're gonna have a major problem, that this is a country with growing aspirations that did not think too highly of us.
Yeah. Well, so knowing a little bit about your trail of infamy and your career, you spend your time destroying U.S.-China relations in Beijing, of course.
That's right.
Luckily, you made it out safely.
That's right.
And then you went into the smooth and peaceful Bush administration. So talk a little bit about how you made your way into the office of the Secretary of Defense. I mean, I don't know if I've shared with other people that often, but I was pretty naive and ignorant about how government ran in the 1990s. I thought a lot about policy, thought I knew a thing or two, but I remember one day getting a message from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and I thought that was actually the Office of the Secretary of Defense,
Right.
not understanding that was like for the thousands of people that are working at the Pentagon. But you went in there and actually worked for real. How did you go from student studying things in Beijing to working in the Pentagon?
Well, I was actually a lawyer in New York, doing what I thought would be international transactions with Asia, Korea, and other places, which just meant you were doing the same kind of contracts, just they happened to be with a Korean client. So a little bit disabused of the notion that there was anything particularly sexy or more interesting about international financial law. But I had this master's degree, and I had this background in strategic affairs and Chinese, and I kind of bothered everybody I knew who was going into the Bush administration, and said, "Look, I'm qualified," which, as you know well, given your experience, is not always the case for people who are looking for jobs in new administrations. So, for a whole host of reasons based on who I knew and what I knew, I actually got placed in the right place, which was on the China desk of the Office of Secretary of Defense. And as you say, it's not the actual Secretary of Defense office. It's a 2,000 person staff doing policy, the policy shop of the Department of Defense. And at the time, 2001, I guess, is when it started. There were maybe maybe four people doing China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Mongolia. Tiny office, and maybe a couple more doing Japan. So it just wasn't where U.S. priorities lay. But that personally gave me a lot of experience working bilateral issues, particularly with Taiwan. As you well know, there was a massive arms sales in April 2001 that had to actually be implemented. Office of Secretary of Defense took a strong and leading role in that. And Taiwan was going through a defense transformation as well as it was democratizing. So I was in Taiwan all the time, working on those issues, and then also working on trying to figure out what the China military relationship was going to look like, the U.S.-China defense relationship, which is still, problematic in many ways.
Yeah. Well, for people that are watching and listening that are interested in trying to get involved, basically the process you described, Dan, I think is among the most common of what people go through. I mean, there are tons of people who say that they're for sure going to serve in an administration, and tons of people who say, I have no idea how it's going to end up working out. And most of the time, it's as you described, people that you try to make the case that you'd like to do something, that you're qualified to do something. And sometimes by hook or by crook or just by luck, you end up somewhere. And there's no matter what you think going in, you're learning a lot when you go do it. And no matter how big you think a problem is, you'll probably be shocked to realize how few people are actually doing the work on some of the things that are really, really important, which might be heartening in some ways, but it's a little bit frightening at first when you realize that. So I appreciate you sharing that, because I think it's actually an important tale for those that are trying to work their ways into those kinds of opportunities to serve. But let's jump a little bit forward in the arc of things. You wrote a book about the Chinese state, and if I'm maybe swapping the words out a little bit, talking about it being in a more fragile state than the common narrative of China rising. And as you've talked often, and many others have made the point, the Chinese, the CCP especially, likes to talk about China being on the rise and the West, and especially the United States, being on the decline. But without putting words in your mouth, I'm getting a sense that your book is probably telling the more truthful tale, that there are some weaknesses in the Chinese system. So fill us in a little bit about that foundational work on how to think about China. What are we really dealing with?
Yeah, no, I think you put it well. So there's no question, that the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, um, through their expressions in the 19th Party Congress in 2017, which my book goes into, believe that they're on a roll and they're doing really well, and their time has come, and it's their time to march to the center of world politics. But as you look closer, so I go through in the book the grand ambitions and the roots of those ambitions too. So there's a decent amount of history as to why Chinese leaders today think that China's rightful place is to be at the center of world politics. But you look at some of the problems, and it's some of them just seem hard to surmount. I mean, so demographic issues, which are now much better known, I think, to the public, just the fast aging of China, and all the different fiscal strains that will bring or are bringing, including a shrinking workforce. Some of the pains of how China grew economically. So the debt that it's taken on, and how that is weighing down the Chinese economy. And then the book also gets into how, what I believe the Chinese overcame a crisis in 2012 of leadership succession, because there was a real challenge to Xi Jinping's succession, which I think is not that well known. There was another individual. All this, obviously, Steve, but the Bo Xilai, who was a very ambitious leader of Chongqing and other provinces through his career, and made a bid independently to usurp the power of Xi Jinping and take over the leadership of the CCP and of China. And he was brought down through a scandal that his wife was involved in, and so forth. But my belief when I was writing the book was Xi Jinping was still dealing with a fallout from leadership divisions. So much of his campaigns of purges and so-called anti-corruption moves were to actually take out his opponents in elite politics. And in my view, that has created a kind of dynamic in which the purges can't really stop, and you start purging the purgers and so forth, and you get more of a kind of Stalin-esque type of system with less agility than under Deng Xiaoping and others. So I think they're managing real problems. The ambitions are there, and so there's this duality of ambition and power, without a doubt, more power. But this duality that they also are facing closing windows and problems, and a real juggling act to keep it all together.
Yeah. Well, I think it's definitely the case that in the narratives about Xi Jinping, very, very few people point out what that transition was like. And anyone who's gone through the sort of cutlery throwing and inserting process of politics has experienced, and that's just in the free world. You can experience that, and knife fights in the communist system can literally be fatal. I always remember prior to 2012, one of the last times I was able to go to China, that people talked about Xi Jinping and his Shanghai experience in very reformist tones, opening up of stock markets and different approaches to development. And I guess it just sort of is rattled in my mind without any way to answer it. And it doesn't matter what the answer is, because he's turned out to be what he is. But was he always going to be the way he's turned out? Or was it that knife fight that sort of brought these demons out to actually be committed to sort of a revived cultural revolution and all of that? And I don't have a strong view. And like I said, I sort of dismiss whether it matters because he is what he is. But just that story that you told, I don't think gets told very much. And that stuff does kind of matter. And it matters that you're probably not going to forge a relationship of rapport with someone that has come out of that fighting. If they don't even trust their own people, they're not going to trust you. So anyway, that's a discussion for another day about whether American presidents should trust what they're getting out of their bilateral conversations. But let's jump from that period and that subject matter, because I think it's still relevant in terms of the Chinese system about their fragilities and weaknesses. I think the United States never does a very good job of exploiting those. But let's talk a little bit more now about one of the issues that is in the news and that you and I have both come and gone from for years and years and years, and that's the fantasy island of Taiwan, where all of your dreams can come true. And the people have had all kinds of theories, and on any given day, anyone's an expert on it. And they could say Taiwan is next, but it's probably more complicated than that. And they could be invaded and taken over, but it also could be more complicated than that too. And you've been through in and out of government lots of these conversations, but right now you are part of a new initiative that's looking at coercive campaigns, if I understand it right. And that's sort of in that sweet spot between 100% peaceful evolution and 100% it's going to be bombs have fallen and invasion occupation. There's probably some other stuff in that mix. So can you walk us into what the project is called, how it came about?
Absolutely. And I think you're right to point out that Chinese external policy, when it comes to Taiwan, when it comes to the Philippines, when it comes to the U.S., when it comes to Japan, is very much informed by Xi Jinping's own near-death experiences and knife fighting inside the CCP. That's part and parcel of how he views. That's how he views domestic politics. That's how he views international politics, as very competitive, as ruthless, as a fight to the death. When it comes to the Taiwan issue, as you and I both know, there are a lot of other issues and ambitions the Chinese have. Washington, D.C. is obsessed with the Taiwan issue. There are good reasons for that, but we can't take our eye off other ambitions the Chinese have. Now, that said, the project that we've undertaken, and we put out a report called From Coercion to Capitulation, How China Can Take Taiwan Without a War, is because I saw what was needed right now is a corrective to a kind of obsession about a D-Day like scenario that people are competing over, in my view, when it'll happen. It'll happen next week, it'll happen next year. And I think if you really understand Taiwan and you really understand China as you do, Steve, you can see that China has other options, and it has. And what we looked at is what we actually put ourselves through is an exercise in what we would do if we were the Chinese strategic planners tasked to take Taiwan without starting a major war in the Western Pacific. And so we go through in this report in rigorous detail the political pathways, the political warfare, economic coercion, low intensity uses of force like the Chinese use in the South China Sea and like we're seeing in the Taiwan Strait. So a maritime encroachment, shipping inspections, the use of lawfare to say that the Taiwan Strait is Chinese waters, information attacks on the United States and on Taiwan, physical sabotage in Taiwan, just creating a feeling of chaos on the island such that people lose confidence in the Taiwan government. Over the course, a coordinated, intensified course of 4 years, and then we lay out a pathway into, how the Chinese can manipulate a peace camp in Taiwan, which exists, in latent form right now, such that it can come to some kind of political agreement with Taiwan that's a Trojan horse for Taiwan giving away its autonomy in exchange for peace, in exchange for these painful activities ceasing. The center of gravity of a campaign like that is attacking the U.S. commitment to Taiwan, which I think is possible to do, and we lay out how to do that, and attacking the confidence that Taiwan people have in the Taiwan government's ability to protect them. So we lay all that out in detail, and in a lot of detail, including the political pathways to this agreement on favorable terms to Beijing. And finally, I'd say that we use a lot of what China's already done in the sort of hybrid warfare coercive context in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and say China's been quite successful actually in hybrid warfare around its periphery. So I think they think they can succeed with respect to Taiwan.
Yeah, well, I think the South China Sea, which I somewhat revisionistly will only call the South Sea, because in Chinese they don't say the China, and in English we're not going to give them a freebie. But I still catch myself throwing it in all the time because there's lifetime of habits in doing that. But they have been amazingly successful in their crazy territorial claims, creation of islands that will not be militarized, and then they are militarized. And I think that is an extremely cautionary tale across administrations, and really with changes in Asia, where this has really been able to slow cook in a way extremely successfully for the CCP. And I think it should be a very cautionary tale with regard to the Taiwan Strait and the East Sea. So there's definitely got to be some lessons that are learned there. But there's a part of what you were sketching out that sort of forces me to go back to you being on the China desk at the Pentagon, because so if you're at the China desk at the Pentagon, how much of your time were you spending looking at sort of the nuts and bolts hard power stuff? And how much of your time are you spending looking at these other areas? We'll leave aside whether that's good or bad, because I think we both will agree what the answer is. Mm-hmm. But just so people get a sense, when you get put there, you got a handful of people. You're probably dealing a lot with the nuts and bolts of all of this.
That's right, and I think it's a great question because the incentives, at the Department of Defense, which is a powerful department in U.S. national security affairs, is to really focus on traditional conventional attack by China against Taiwan, and how to defend against that. And I'm not saying we shouldn't take that seriously. We should take that seriously, but the kinds of things that China actually does, this kind of coercion of other countries under the threshold of war, which involves comprehensive instruments of power and political warfare, the U.S. is just not set up to counter. We haven't been in that business since the first Cold War against the Soviets. Even then, it was problematic. But countering information campaigns and disinformation campaigns, countering subversion of our allies, political subversion, countering lower threshold uses. Part of the reason, Steve, that we didn't have we watched in slow motion as the South China Sea is falling under Chinese control, and they've used everything from Coast Guard and maritime shipping vessels to, as you say, creating islands. And the response from us, a smart response, would have been imposing asymmetric political costs. But that's a very complicated thing to do that can't be run out of DoD. So to answer your question, DoD is focused on the conventional balance, increasingly not just the conventional balance, the nuclear balance across the strait and other contingencies. That's the work of a person on a China desk. That's the work of the person on the Taiwan desk, getting Taiwan ready for a counter invasion. And we're kind of losing some ground when it comes to Chinese political warfare and coercion.
And the other parts of government are organized for other purposes too. I mean, if the State Department is about diplomacy, it isn't exactly the best house for information warfare either. And so we've got a lot of really imperfect pieces of this Frankenstein that kind of need to get reordered and revived. But to go back to this project, so you've had an initial report or two, and is it going to run as a series that's one building upon another? What's kind of the arc of how this is probably going to carry forward, and what have been sort of your kind of core takeaways so far?
Yeah, so the first report, which came out last year, was just explaining how China has three different paths to Taipei, not just one, not just the overarching compelling through invasion and occupation. So first there was just a conceptual explanation of the three different paths that they have towards to take over Taipei. The next year, we've built a really strong team of young Chinese linguists and strategists, and we're going to go through a series of planning exercises to actually look at what happens if this coercion path doesn't work for China. So what would China do then? Would it then start, to more massively employ the use of force to take over the island? Now, our going in proposition, one of the things that we're seeing that is missing in a lot of the discussions of what that would look like is some of the basic geopolitical assumptions that China would have to take into consideration if they decided to do that. A big one is, if China is actually going to put 250,000 troops on the island of Taiwan, put a bunch of guys in boats and send them across the strait, they're going to have to decide to either attack Japan so they get rid of U.S. air power, because nobody's ever done an amphibious landing with their enemy still being able to function in the air the way we would be able to function, or take the risk of not doing so. But that's a major geopolitical decision by Xi Jinping. Attacking Japan, would start World War III. That's a U.S. ally. That would be U.S. would be in it no matter what. If that happened, that would change the world. So we're thinking through some of the geopolitical assumptions that Xi Jinping would have to, and some of his own dilemmas, which I think are not well considered in some of the wargaming we're seeing. That's one of our contributions, I think, to the debate, or going to be one of the contributions. The other, I think, that's important is because I'm working with the Institute for Study of War and Kim and Fred Kagan and all their work on Russia and Ukraine, is really incorporating the new lessons for the future of warfare into scenarios and planning for how China would think about going to war with Taiwan and the United States and Japan, and how Taiwan and Japan can think about a new style of defense, based on whoever learns first what's unfolding on the battlefield in the Ukraine. So that's going to be the next year of effort. It's going to be a series of papers, on this topic. But the bottom line is, the first takeaway is we think that the short of war campaign that I first described, the coercive campaign, can succeed. We need strategies to undermine it. I think we're seeing we're seeing as William Lai in Taiwan takes office. We'll see an intensification of the military intimidation, the military coercion, manipulation of the legislature. So we very much want people to pay attention to the short of war campaign, but we're also going to look at very carefully and in very rigorous fashion what China does if that short of war campaign fails.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess there's two things that sort of jump to my mind in what you've laid out. Up until not that long ago, I wouldn't have even considered it, but it sounds to me like the exact same logic would apply to a southern-oriented part of the Taiwan theater with the Philippines, given that China really has amped up the encroachment, attack, and bullying of the Philippines, and it's just as logically impossible to get around to Taiwan's Pacific coast without violating the Philippines' sea and airspace, because they also have islands that are very close to Taiwan's territorial waters and airspace, just like the Japanese southernmost islands are much closer to Taiwan than people realize. And each of those, at least on paper, and I would like to think in reality, those are treaty allies where an attack on one is an attack on all. It's actually automatic that war plans kick into place, so that's, I assume that your project is going to, just as it does the Japan angle, the Philippines angle is just as relevant now too. Although it's been the land of perpetual promise without ever getting to the promised land in a lot of ways, but maybe this has been a sobriety checkpoint that's different. I guess the other question. So I take it as a given that it's a yes. That the Philippines part
Yes,
is a part
yes.
of that now.
I mean, the way I would just put that is the way we are going to tackle this problem is if you're sitting in Xi Jinping's, if you're Xi Jinping and you're deciding on the use of force, it's a major decision. It's a decision to start a world war over Taiwan, and it would involve the Philippines. It would involve Japan. You have a major geopolitical dilemma. So what would have to change in China for him to make that decision?
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely. The way you're putting it is absolutely correct.
Well, I guess the part of the current dialogue about lessons from Russia, Ukraine, and leaving aside NATO versus Russia or whatever else, but you're basically just speaking in layman's terms. You're dealing with a land war.
Yes.
And you would have to drop a lot of material into Taiwan to have a land war.
Yes.
And the Japan role, the Philippines role, the offshore islands. So, I mean, so rebut the insta-critic that says there aren't really that many lessons from the Russian invasion of Ukraine that are relevant to what China's calculus for Taiwan would be.
So so far, and I'm really just going through the process of learning the lessons myself. The major competition between Russia and Ukraine is twofold. One is drone versus electronic warfare, and who's adapting more quickly. And I think that would pertain in the maritime theater as well. Different kinds of drones, different kinds of electronic warfare, but that's a very quickly changing calculation all the time on the battlefield that I think all countries are going to need to learn because that's just going to be a feature of warfare, I think, going forward. So the role of drones and the role of electronic warfare, who's adapting more quickly. The other is missiles versus counter missiles, and that pertains to the theater as well. So the Ukrainians shot down a lot of Russian missiles, and the things are changing and so forth. But I think that threw a lot of people off in terms of how many land attack cruise missiles and other types of even close to hypersonics the Ukrainians managed to shoot at. And the missile war did not go the way that I think most people watching the missile counter missile competition in Asia thought they would. So I think those are the two major operational lessons that have implications in this maritime theater as well.
Yeah.
And to your point about not taking advantage of China's weaknesses, your description of the strategic geography actually gives Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines interesting options when it comes to drone warfare and missile warfare in their theaters. And there's a lot of problems we can cause China if we learn the right lessons.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of other things I'd throw into the hopper, for free, since I'm not going to be working on the project. I can make work for other people. But I think another interesting angle on Ukraine is information warfare. This is the first conflict in my memory where the smaller, less ruthless party actually seemed to win at least the initial phases of an information warfare campaign. And Taiwan probably talks about this and thinks about this. I don't know that they have a strong foundation to have that confidence right now. China is much more embedded into international media and discourse than Russia has been. And so, but I think that actually was a really interesting X factor that I don't think Moscow planned that they were going to lose an information war with Ukraine. And I think they did. I think the conflict itself is still to be determined in some very uncomfortable ways. But that initial phase, that a major power was ground to a halt and at least lost the initial phases where people were like, holy crap, these guys could survive. I think that was a pretty significant development that East Asians should want and learn. And I think the other part of it was something that Taiwan, under its current politics, and a lot of our Asian allies aren't going to consider unless forced to. But in Ukraine, grandma and grandpa were carrying weapons. And so if you're going neighborhood to neighborhood to try to kick in doors and compel people into submission with a real invasion, which may not be what option A is for the CCP, but if you're going to do that, having people who were actually trained and equipped to do at least minimal resistance on their own, and to have the confidence that they would have that minimal resistance, I think also factored into that weathering the first and maybe second wave of the campaign. Do you have sort of a similar impression that's already baked into the cake, or are those added layers of things to tease out in this?
No, I think you raise a really good point that we need to assimilate into our work about the information war. There's also big technical differences. As you mentioned before, Taiwan is an island that can be cut off in terms of its communications as well. But I think you're absolutely right to point out that, and some of the things the U.S. did early on in the conflict, like declassify the intelligence, was about Russia was a very good peace moment in U.S. information operation. So I think all of that is hugely important. There's one other lesson I think that we're going to have to all think through, which is the Russians have been threatening the use of nuclear weapons probably more than any country has since 1945. And I think with the Chinese strategic nuclear breakout, they're sitting there watching how you can shape uh, Washington in terms of Washington wanting to de escalate even the conventional arms it transfers to a partner under the threat of nuclear weapons. So I think we're moving into a very dangerous stage where the Chinese are going to be conducting coercion under a nuclear shadow, shaping responses in various capitals about how far we want to go, even helping allies by arming them. So that would be the other lesson we have to assimilate carefully to this context.
Yeah. Well, as we sort of wind toward a conclusion, a couple of baskets that still are on my mind that I'd like to draw you out on. One is uh, so, given the nature of the challenge, sort of the imbalances and fact that it's not like this threat has snuck up on America. It's really been coming for a long time, and anyone willing to look has been able to see it. And yet, here we are. Why would you have confidence that we're going to get our act together and be able to overcome this? And what are some of the things that we might be able to do, or our allies might be able to do, so that there's more doubt in China that this is a good time or this is a favorable environment?
Yeah, I think that's the key. The two questions are related, right? So the we need to rebuild our own confidence that that this is a winnable rivalry, and that the prevention of war on our terms is doable. I think that while we have to mobilize the U.S. public and help everyone understand what the challenge is, well, we don't want to create a sense of defeatism, at the same time. So I think what I try to do through my own small contributions is to point the way forward as to strategies that will actually work. Now, to your point about weaknesses and so forth, this Cold War has two central fronts. Just as the first Cold War did. One is in the Western Pacific, one is in the Bay of Bengal, opening into the Indian Ocean. Those are the two places the Chinese can really get out and project its maritime power. With a set of diplomatic, economic, military policies, and I'm not saying we will get our act together, but there is a path alighted before us with a series of countries in those regions that can really complicate and even contain Chinese power. In those two fronts, in the Western Pacific and in the Bay of Bengal. That's where I would focus my energies. That's where I would harden and make the countries that we're partnering with more resilient. That's where I would focus my power. If China can't project its power out of those two areas, then it's going to have a harder time projecting its power globally.
Yeah, well, I assume a part of all of this grand strategy also has to be the United States and a coalition of the willing getting serious about realigning our supply chains and dependency relationships. Because whether we feel like we have choices and options, the Chinese for sure think that any dependency on them is immediate leverage that they can and will use against you when they want to. And we've got a lot of work to do. I mean, from my point of view, the United States built this problem, and the United States can build the solution too. Neither were free and easy. In some ways, it was easy to fund a threat with privileged capital and opportunity and access, but what was given by us can be given to others too, if we're wise about it. But those dependency relationships give me a lot of pause, even in a place like Taiwan. And we look around the Horn, where India is, and where some of those South Asian economies are oriented. There's more disentangling than one would think at first blush.
Absolutely, and there is, if we put it in terms of opportunity, that other countries have opportunities to become preferred suppliers to the United States in the big markets, India being one of them, some of the South Asian states when it comes to pharmaceuticals, for example, some of the Southeast Asian nations when it comes to some of the semiconductor supply chain. If we put it more in terms of opportunities, I think we'll have more success in actual disentanglement. I mean, there'll be friction and cost to changing, but you're absolutely right. I mean, we cannot conduct ourselves in a rivalry with China while we're dependent upon them for pharmaceuticals and dependent upon them for critical minerals. I mean, that is not possible. That's a big part of the grand strategy.
Well, so we end at the beginning, where first lesson in China studies is common sense shall play no role until after everything else has been tried and failed. And now we come back to trying to do what was probably painfully obvious to a lot of us, and then our betters and circumstances forced all kinds of other things to happen. But yeah, you can't feed an enemy that wants to hurt you. You can't be dependent on them. And the world is a better place with friends that are reliable and capable. And so hopefully we can do some of those things right. But Dan, it's been great talking with you today, and I hope the audience enjoys learning more about the work that you're doing. To follow your work, commentary, etc., there's a point or two you would direct people to keep up with what you're doing and saying on policy?
Well, I'm still on X, Twitter. So D Alex Blumenthal is the handle. I put a lot of things up on LinkedIn as well. As I know you do, and that's probably the best way to. I'll at least link things that I publish. I may not get into Twitter fights, which I try to avoid, but I'll link things that I publish.
So you're not a practitioner of the information war, is what I take away from
that's
that.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Dan, thank you very much. And to our audience, we thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing. and take a visit to the ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you for today's episode. Special thank you to Dan Blumenthal for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.